Welcome to our webinar, Project-Based Learning, How to Design a Project. My name is Meredith Love, and I'm the co-director of the Center of Excellence for College and Career Readiness at Francis Marion University. So today in this webinar, we are going to talk about the definitions of project-based learning. We're going to talk a little bit about why we would even want to do project-based learning with our students and what some of those benefits might be. And then we will also talk through the essential design elements of an effective project, which I hope will set you up to be able to design a project of your own. But let's go ahead and get started today by watching a quick video.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something?
Help!
I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
No. Well, there's not enough left to do, is there?
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he could fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
So I show you that video as a way of kind of getting into this question about why investigate PBL. And let's talk a little bit about why project-based learning might be helpful to us and what this video shows us. A lot of times when we show that video to the teachers that we work with, they talk about their students, that they think about the people on the escalator being their students, that the minute that they're stuck, they just don't know what to do, right? That they cannot see solutions in front of them. They're not good at solving their own problems. And that sort of matches with what we see oftentimes in the first year writing classroom in our university life classes. I was composition coordinator for 10 years at Francis Marion, and I routinely teach first year writing. And so we see students struggle a lot with those kinds of things. So the way that we might talk about that is to call them help-seeking behaviors. So again, when students hit some kind of struggle, they're not sure how to help themselves or even where to go for help. The other thing that we see students oftentimes struggling with is motivation. If they're not intrinsically motivated or motivated by grades, they don't really know like why they're in school maybe or why they should keep going. Problem solving, as I mentioned before, is something that we see students struggle with. And a fixed mindset. So this idea that, oh, well, I'm not a math person. Oh, I'm just not a writer. This notion that they are who they are, their brains are what they are, and that they can't learn other things, or that they're in some way limited, that there's only like a certain threshold that they can hit with their learning. And then, of course, there's fear of failure. We see this quite often with our best students, our strongest students, our students who did very, very well in high school. They want to always know with the assignment, what do I need to do to get an A? They usually, are very motivated, but they're afraid of taking a risk. They oftentimes don't see school as a place where they learn, but as a place where they earn grades and they earn affirmation, right? So fear of failure, these are all things that we think can contribute to students struggling both in high school, but particularly in college when we see them. So of course, this is the profile of the South Carolina graduate, something that I'm sure you have all seen. A little background on this document, if you don't know it already. This was a document that was put together collaboratively by a number of groups in the state, the Department of Education, the Council on Competitiveness, the South Carolina Oversight Committee, Superintendent's Roundtable. All those places are listed at the bottom of that document. But the way I see this document is that you could look at this as sort of a definition of college and career readiness for the state of South Carolina. And when we look at project-based learning, I want to go ahead and read this quote from a book by John Larmer, John Mergendaler, and Susie Boss. This is going to be on a resource page for you, but I want to read this quote. Project-based learning provides opportunities for students to build these qualities, as well as more deeply learn traditional academic content and how it applies to the real world. So if we go back to this profile and we look at world-class knowledge in particular, these are our standards, right? These are the standards that the state has set up for us to make sure that students know this material. And one thing that the research has shown about project-based learning is that as a method of teaching, it can help students learn the material more effectively, to remember it, and to transfer that material. So project-based learning can help us meet this part of the profile, this world-class knowledge part. The other part of the profile are these two other sections, one called world-class skills, which includes things like knowing how to learn, collaboration, teamwork, creativity, innovation, problem solving, and then life and career characteristics, or what I like to call like habits of mind, right? Work ethic, interpersonal skills, integrity, self-direction. And the other good thing about project-based learning is not only does it help students with that academic side and gaining knowledge, it also helps them with these other two sections from the same book. In PBL Done Well, students not only find themselves needing to use college and career readiness skills, they are explicitly taught them, assessed on them, and asked to reflect on their growth in them. And that's something that we're going to talk about today. As we design project-based learning experiences for our students, we are thinking not only about how can they learn these particular standards, how can I cover this material, but also what is this project asking them to do that helps them to build these skills. And a lot of times we might, in the back of our mind, knowing that our assignments or our reading or our project is helping them with these skills. But what project-based learning asks teachers to do is to make that more explicit. To say, let's talk about how to be a good collaborator. To say, okay, we have this problem in front of us. How are we going to solve it? To say, how are you feeling about the project? Do you feel like you're getting ready to give up? Does anyone need a pep talk about perseverance? So you talk about these qualities, not just, you hope students pick them up along the way, but you're more intentional. And now let's watch this quick video that does a good job explaining project-based learning.
Remember what it was like in school. It was boring. You sat in class, memorized as much as you could, and tried to pass a test at the end. But is that good enough? These days, school can be more interesting and effective by focusing students on work that matters. This is project-based learning explained. Most adults live in a world of projects. Whether it's a job assignment, home improvement, or planning a wedding, we need to actively solve problems. But unfortunately, schoolwork looks more like this than this. Let's take a look at this project-based world. Meet Claire. She was recently presented with a challenge. Her company, SuperSuds, makes soap, and it was up to her to find the most earth-friendly way to produce it in the future. Her boss gave her a budget and a few requirements, and it was up to her to come up with a solution. She organized and managed a team who researched the options and created materials summarizing the issues. Claire's team asked for feedback and presented their findings to the boss. Claire came out of the project looking like a rock star, and she learned a lot about green products. If you look closely, Claire's success involved critical thinking, collaboration, and communication, things that aren't often taught in traditional classrooms. The world needs more Claires, so how do we get them? The answer is project-based learning, or PBL. By focusing students on a project, teachers put them on a path that deepens their knowledge and builds skills they'll need in the future. Here's what I mean. Mr. Simmons has always been a good science teacher, and his students do well on Friday's tests. Unfortunately, what they learned was gone by Saturday morning. That wasn't good enough for him. Soon he learned about project-based learning and decided to give it a shot. Mr. Simmons got the idea for his first project on microorganisms when nearly half of his students were suddenly absent with the flu. He asked his students why they thought so many of their classmates got sick at the same time. That lively discussion produced a lot of good questions and a list of things the kids wanted to know. Mr. Simmons then announced their project was to help elementary school kids understand, how can we not get sick? After dividing the class into teams, he got them started on the project. It was up to the students to ask questions, research, collaborate, give each other feedback, and figure out the best ways to make their points clear to children. One team chose to make an educational video on the connection between hand washing and avoiding the flu. Another chose to create posters to show how viruses spread. The project teams showed off their final work to an enthusiastic audience of parents and their children at a nearby elementary school. Sitting in the front row was our good friend and local rock star Claire, who saw a bit of herself in the students. It was clear that the project was a success for the students, the audience, and Mr. Simmons. His students practiced critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. The project wasn't about memorization, but learning in depth about viruses and how to prevent spreading disease, a lesson they will never forget. At the end of the presentation, Claire introduced herself to the students and told them that they were rock stars and that the world needs more people who can think like them. To learn more about project-based learning, go to BIE.org.
Okay, so I think that we could all agree that we would love to be Mr. Simmons and have students who are rock stars like this. And, this video is, of course, very timely given our current situation with the pandemic. But, I think it's worth thinking a little bit about what is it that we see in this video that we like? What kinds of things are, compelling to us in terms of what our classrooms would look like if we were able to teach like this, or maybe you already do projects and you do have some real world elements. One of the things that you can think about today is how to make your projects even more robust. And that is what some of these essential design elements that we'll talk about in a little bit should help us do. Okay, so let me talk through our agenda for the rest of our time together. Right now, we're going to talk about PBL as a teaching method, thinking of the differences between a project and project-based learning. Then we're going to talk about the actual components of a project, what pieces need to go into an effective project. We will discuss different ways of finding topics for projects, and then finally, we will talk about the steps of project design. So, PBL as a teaching method. One of the things that we need to think about with our teaching is the fact that our most motivated students are going to learn material in order to perform well on tests, or because they're just these kids who just really want to learn, who for whatever reason just have this intrinsic motivation. But what about students who aren't motivated by grades? How do we convince students that they need to know the material we are teaching? How many times have we heard from our students, why do we need to know this? Why do we need to know this? And one of the things that I try to make sure that I'm challenging myself on, and that I tell my pre-service teacher students about is the fact that if we don't know why we're teaching something, we really need to stop and think it through and figure out what we're doing. It can't just be because it's on the standards. The standards are the standards, but we really need to dig deep and figure out why students need to know this material. And one of the ways that we can do that is to show students how they might use it, or show them how others are using this material and how they can use it too. So in short, we are teaching students to do when we teach project-based learning. Students, when in a well-designed project, students are going to use and apply their understanding of material to answer a question. So they're going to have a central question in a project, and their learning the material is a way for them to answer that question. And as they do that, they will not only learn the material, but they will practice critical thinking and collaboration and self-management. In a traditional classroom with a culminating project, so with a traditional unit, let's say, where we read Little Women and then do book reports on Little Women, or part of the class reads one book, part of the class is the other one, and we all do a book report. I remember we all had to pick either a president or a first lady, I think in like 4th grade, to do that. So usually what happens when students have projects is we lecture about the topic, and maybe they do an activity and then an assessment, or we lecture and they do an activity and an assessment with a review and examine a project. Another really common one that we can talk about would be the solar system project, right? So you would lecture about the solar system and teach them all about the solar system and the different planets and go through a process like this. And then at the end, they would make their model, right? With the foam planets. I remember having to make something like that in school. I haven't seen my kids do it yet, but I hear it's still around. What's different between this traditional unit that has a culminating project here at the end and project-based learning can be symbolized like this. So if you have a project-based learning unit, here's how it might look. And I'm going to use the example of a project that I've read about regarding kids in an elementary school and roaches. Okay, so the kids noticed that there were a lot of bugs in their school. So one of the things that the teachers did is she designed a project around this issue of roaches. And so usually there's some kind of entry event, some kind of activity that the students do, or speaker that might come in. We'll talk more about this later, but where students are introduced to this project. And then, so the question's laid in front of them. What can we do about the roach problem in our school? And then the teacher works with the students to create what's called a need to know list. So in order to solve this problem of the roaches, what do we need to know? And guiding them through a discussion, you might end up having questions like, well, what are the life cycle of roaches? Or what do roaches eat? Or what are they attracted to? Or what kind of human behaviors cause roach infestation? So all of these things. And then through scaffolding, the teacher might do something like a mini lecture, or might have students do a reading and then check in and see how they're doing. And then they might have discussions or interviews. Maybe they bring in some pest control experts or some scientists who study these kinds of things, communities and pest control and all this stuff. And they learn more and they learn more, but they're always learning, and they're going through these activities, which are activities that happen in a traditional classroom too, but they're doing it in order to answer their question, in order to figure out about the roaches. And then they might develop some kind of plan that they present perhaps to the principal or to the head of the maintenance staff for the district or something like that. So in a project-based learning unit, the question that is at the center, how can we get rid of our roaches, propels the learning. So we're going to dig a little deeper into that. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that our job is to design and plan projects that lead towards our students fulfilling standards. It means that we scaffold the learning. There is a lot of planning that goes into delivering an effective project. More planning, I would say, than in a traditional sort of unit. Assessing students' progress, engaging and coaching students, and managing the project process. But sometimes when I present project-based learning, teachers think, so I'm just supposed to throw out all my notebooks and all of these lessons that I've done all these years and all of the stuff I learned how to, all these things I learned how to do in school. And the answer to that is no. It is it is a shift from learning being about the teacher presenting information and moving towards a very John Dewey model of the teacher putting a problem in front of his or her students for them to tackle. In the process of doing that, we're still teaching students to listen. We're still teaching them how to take notes. I mean, imagine if somebody came to talk to the students, they might develop interview questions and take notes on that interview as a way of gathering data and information. They still research. They still have structure in the classroom. It's not like, okay, here's your question, go. It's you guiding them through a process so that they can answer that question. And we still teach our areas of expertise. We are still science teachers. We are still English teachers. We are still history teachers. So those sort of projects, like the solar system project that I talked about, are often called dessert projects. A lot of this language comes from the Buck Institute. It used to be at BIE.org, but it's now at PBL Works, and that will also be on your resource sheet at the end. But dessert projects are ones where students learn the content, and then they do something. It's sort of like, if we have time, or if I'm not too full, I'll go ahead and have dessert. If we have time, if we're not already, exhausted or up against some other kind of deadline, then we'll do the project. So it's something that can just be eliminated if it needed to be, but it's there. What the Buck Institute calls a main course project is one that's meaty, it is wholesome, it is not something that you stick at the end, but it is something that drives the entire process. So let me talk through the differences a little bit more. So let's stick with our solar system project, or with the bug project. We could think about, do you remember when in elementary school, I don't know if you all did this, but we had that cruel project where you would take a foam board and you would collect insects and stick the pins through the insect and then label it and stick the pins through the insect, and you'd have all different kinds, or maybe you were supposed to collect different examples of a certain kind of bug or whatever. Well, did you have to really know anything about, that really teach you anything about bugs? Well, maybe it gave you a kind of a closer look to it, but probably we learned everything about bugs before we even did that, right? So it's stuck at the end. It is supplemental. So learning about roaches would have been supplemental if all I was supposed to do was like collect a few roaches and stick a pin through them, right? Probably that would have been done after we had learned all about insects and habitats and all that kind of stuff. However, figuring out how to get rid of the roaches in our elementary school is not supplemental. It is meaty. It is the thing that moves us to learn the material. For regular projects, the task is based on following directions from the teacher and is repeated year after year. I think we all might be a little guilty of doing that one. Typically projects, if they're just projects and not project-based learning, are done individually. It's just the student or it's just the parents. I have parents who worked all the time, and I had to do all of my projects by myself, with my mom going to the, craft store on the way home from work at the very last minute to get my projects in. So they're done at home, often independently, or like I said, sometimes the parents do projects for them. It is focused on the product and is often called your projects are due. We will talk about our projects, put your project over there, rather than it being this long-term sort of activity. And really, it's not authentic to the real world or to students' lives. So when you think about making a model of the solar system, what do students learn from making a model of the solar system? Well, they learn to make a model of the solar system, right? Potentially they've already been quizzed or tested on the names of the planets and a fact or two about the planets and where they are in relation to one another. And then they learn how to paint styrofoam balls, or they learn the best adhesive to use to keep the ball stuck at the top of the box, right? It's not really anything that is authentic to their real lives. Now let's go back and let's think about the video and Mr. Simmons and the question about virus spreading, and think about the roaches. That's a pretty authentic problem, right? This idea of having bugs inside, especially down south, is something that all of us will contend with. But in that elementary school, the fact that there were roaches in the elementary school meant that this was a real life situation for students. They could see why they had to learn about bugs, why it was important to understand their habitats, why it was important to know what they liked and what they didn't like, why it's important to know what diseases they spread. All of this, I say all of this good stuff, all of this interesting stuff, because there was a reason to learn it. And then they not only learned about how to prevent roach infestations, but perhaps they learn presentation skills as they talk to the maintenance staff. So all kinds of different things being brought together. Some of the things that are projecty are are book reports. Some people just simply giving presentations on material that you've already covered. I see a lot of projects and not project-based learning around the South Carolina Native American project as well. And then different models are oftentimes just projects and not really project-based learning. So there's our solar system here. I did not make that. I just found this picture. And this one reminds me of another one that I did in school, like a wigwam kind of project. And posters and models and presentations, it's not that they're not good assignments. They can demonstrate knowledge, but that's what they do, right? They show you that the kids learned something. But again, they're often done alone and at home after the material has been presented and taught in the room. So at the end of the meal, it is a dessert project. So instead of a project being supplemental, the project is the unit or the vehicle for teaching content standards. I like that way to think about it. It's the vehicle for teaching. Task is based on following directions. The task is open-ended and involves student voice and choice and often differs from year to year. So maybe it's ants one year, maybe it's roaches one year, or maybe it's a particular problem in the community one year, but that problem's no longer a problem, so you're going to move on to something else. So it's sort of responsive is a way of thinking about project-based learning as well. It's often done in collaboration, much of it in school. So in the classroom, students are conducting this inquiry and coming up with answers to their problem. The project includes a sustained inquiry process and the creation of something. So I had someone call me once and say, can we do a project? Can you come with my students and do a project-based learning in one day? And I said, no, I can't. Part of answering the question is taking the time to reflect, to use various methods to answer the question, to discuss, to work together, to consider what the audience at the end needs to know. And this takes a while. If you're going to explore how to answer a question, you really just don't do that in one day. Maybe experts at the top of their game can do that, but it's not something that is really going to be appropriate with middle or high school or elementary kids. And then projects are often not authentic to the real world. But project-based learning is authentic to the real world or to students' lives. And I'll give you some more examples of that. So here's just a quick cheat sheet. A project is intended to teach significant content in the context of project-based learning. The project creates a need to know the essential content. You need to know about roaches in order to get rid of the infestation. The project is oriented around an open-ended driving question. We'll talk about developing questions that lead your entire, that sort of ground your whole project or act as the vehicle, as the chart said, for learning. And the project will require one or more of these things: critical thinking, inquiry, problem solving, collaboration, communicating, and then eventually communicating to a public audience. So you have a handout that says, it looks like this. Is it a dessert project or a main course project? And I want you to go ahead and stop here and go ahead and fill this out, and then hit play after you filled that out, and we will talk through it. So let's talk through these a little bit. The first one is after a unit on ancient Egypt, students in social studies class are asked to make models of the Egyptian period. Okay, so let's take a look at this chart that you spent a few minutes thinking about. Let's take the very first one and talk about whether or not it is a dessert or a main course project. So after a unit on ancient Egypt, students in a social studies class are asked to make models of the Egyptian pyramids. So your clue on this one should have been the phrase after a unit. So this is a dessert project, again, because students learn the content, then they do the project. And if the project has to get cut, no big deal. If you don't get dessert, no big deal. So that's why this one is a dessert project. The second one, second grade students create a model of a product made from recycled materials and present a PowerPoint presentation about the processes used to make the product to parents and members of the public. So this would, sort of count as a main course PBL unit for a couple of reasons. One of the things, it's not just that they create a model. So they did create a model. That doesn't mean it's dessert just because there's a model, but they have learned about recycled materials and the processes used to make their product. So what they've been doing is, maybe there was a driving question that was something like, how can we recycle these materials in order to make a useful product? Something like that. So they've learned the processes, they've made the product, and then they present it to an audience who cares. So that's why this one, even though it has a model, we could talk about it as being a main course project. Students in a history class study South Carolina history and are asked to create posters for the library about famous South Carolinians. So let's look at this project two ways. You could definitely say that this is a dessert project. Students learn about South Carolina history, and then they create a poster. So they're demonstrating that they know something, which is great, but we wouldn't call it main course PBL. However, I think that there are a couple of things you could do to just tweak this project that would make it a main course project. So let's say you started with, let's say you were in a high school and you said, what South Carolinians do South Carolina high school students need to know about that aren't in the history books, or something like that. And then maybe you would be learning your South Carolina history, but you would also be learning about people who aren't included in the books, who are on the margins, characters, people that we don't hear much about, but who did play important roles. And then you would say, okay, we're gonna study our history. We're also, I want you to keep an eye out for moments where there might be someone who's not mentioned here, or we're going to dig around and see who isn't mentioned in our book, and we are going to design posters. So as we learn this, I want you to think, what would be an important fact to put on this poster? What would be a picture that maybe you come across in order to create this poster? So it would always be thinking about uncovering this history and learning this history in order to communicate it to someone else. So that's one way that you could make that more of a meaty main course project. Okay, the next one. Students in an English class are asked to work in groups to create a video trailer about a novel they read as a class. So we do have elements of project-based learning here. We have collaboration, we have using real-life technologies, But this is still an instance where students read something and then they create something. They read something and then they create something. So how could you make this more like a main course project? Well, you could say, all right, we are going to read this novel, and as we read it, we're going to think about why we would recommend it to somebody. That is going to be the thing that we're going to keep in our heads. Would we recommend this book? Why would we recommend this book? What type of student needs to read this? What type of students would be interested in this book? What parents need to read this? That's kind of an interesting question too. You know, we think about young adult books, but maybe there's lessons and things in there that adults need to learn. So you sort of approach the novel not just in terms of the characters and the plot and all of that kind of stuff, but thinking about another audience for this. And then you can create a video trailer perhaps out of that framework. All right, students in a social studies class are asked to make a diorama of a village based on their study of Native Americans. This is a very popular sort of thing for people to do and has been for a long time. But oftentimes all students learn is what materials make the best kind of diorama or how to best display these things. Again, this is something that if you didn't get to it, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. It's fun, but it's not really necessary. And then the last one. Students in an English class learn about document design and writing for business by creating brochures to promote a local business in town. This is a main course project. You can imagine that perhaps there's a new business. So in our community, we recently got an emergency vet, for example. So you would have that emergency vet come and talk to the students about the business and why they're here and the importance of helping animals and decreasing pet populations in the wild, you know, all of these kinds of things. And then the students would learn about document design, they would learn about concise writing, all of these things so that they could create something to help promote this business. So as they're learning these skills, they're learning them in order to help this business, in order to create these documents. So I hope that that exercise has helped you see a little bit more clearly the difference between having a project and designing a project-based learning unit. So this is a video that we use a lot when we're working on trainings with project-based learning. It's called the Tiny House Project. And as you watch this video, I ask that you think about what is the role of the teacher in this video? What do you like about this classroom or this project in action, seeing these students and these teachers and people work together? And then how is this a main course project? What makes this a main course project rather than a dessert project? So go ahead and watch and take some notes on this, and then I'll come back and talk about some possible responses.
For this project, you are going to design a home, you're going to plan a home, you're going to build a home. This project, the Tiny House Project, is where students are designing tiny houses. Remember, when you're going to build this, we have to think about who's living in the house. There was a boom in tiny homes, just the idea of living in one, just because in the city the population is growing and there's more people, less room. And maybe a tiny house is more cost efficient, more green. Would you like to have your own room? Yeah. Would you like to have your own space? Yeah. Okay. The driving question was, how can we as a design team design a house for clients, taking into consideration budget and location and personal preferences? The entry event was Minecraft. So they used Minecraft to build just a house that they would build for their family.
This is inside the house. This is where, like, the sofa, and over here is where I sleep.
They're able to use their creativity. They're able to just be free and just to build without anybody giving them parameters. Back to our project and this driving question. What do we need to know to answer this question?
Like, say they have family that's gonna come live with them, they have to think about that. Like have a guest room.
The Minecraft building sparked like, how many rooms do we build? And so they came up with their need to knows. Any other need to knows you'd like to add?
You have to imagine how much it costs.
Well, we have to know like how many kids there are or how big the family is, and are those questions that you think you should ask the client? And they're like, yeah. And so we come back to the driving question, we came back to the need to knows, and we came back to their entry event just so that they can get some questions that are appropriate for their project to their clients.
What is the minimum square footage you want?
400 feet.
Do you want a second story?
Yes, second story would be good.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, that'd be cool.
I think it's important for them to know that there's a real client because it gives the project more authenticity.
Would you like to have a garden outside your house?
Yes.
When they form a relationship with the client, then they start to care about what the client thinks.
This is the final product. This is what the construction documents look like. But not too different from that concept drawing, right? We have the bedrooms up here, master bedroom in the corner.
So I asked an expert to come and present to the students, and he was actually a structural engineer.
You can see elevations. Just kind of look at what kind of information's on there. How do you tell a wall is a wall? You can see you put two lines parallel to one another.
And we talked about making blueprints and what does that look like, or having a layout.
Oh, look, it even has plants right here. I want these.
These are called elevations.
I think they were really excited about seeing the blueprints because it was just real things that they can hold, they can touch, and they can see, and they know that engineers touched it and engineers made this, and this is what we're going to do. All right, we're gonna move into our next rotation. On this side, we have Front Row and RAS Kids for listening to reading and answering comprehension questions. So as we plan the project, we think about the standards that we're going to be using. In this project, we're using opinion writing or reading of informational text, and we integrate that into like a daily rotation of in English language arts. So this is an article from NASA, and it's called Tiny House Fun. If you have something you want to highlight, like you want to get back to, or a word that you really don't understand and you want to learn more about that, you can highlight some words. So on that day, I had a group and we were looking at informational reading. And then another group, they were listening to a book that had to do with houses. And then another group was working on vocabulary, and all the vocabulary is part of the project. And then another group was just doing their read to self, and that's just books that they're interested in, so they're practicing reading independently. Write your name at the top. For math rotations, we call it math with the teacher, math with technology, and math with a partner. The house size that your client wanted. And then I'm working with the group, and we're really looking at area and perimeter and the difference between area and perimeter. Okay, so can you tell me what the square units are here? Another activity that we did with math was the Cheez-Its math. When they looked at square footage, we said that each Cheez-Its was 1 square inch, and they used that kind of information to do square footage within a house. It was just kind of a connection for them. To help them refine their designs of their homes, students went through a feedback protocol.
I turned the bathtub from here to here because I know that you can't get to the toilet if it was like that. There's the bathroom with the shower. Yeah.
They were paired up with another group, and they presented their models, they presented their blueprints and their layout, and they talked about what was in the house and who their client was, just to get some feedback from their peers.
Our client is Miss Pena. Her age is 39. Her budget is $40,000.
Within the fishbowl protocol, what we did was, me and another teacher, we sat in front of a presenting group, and everyone else looked around us, just like a fishbowl where they're not to talk, they're not to say anything, they're just really listening and seeing the interaction between the presenter and the guest.
I like how you do go into the living room, but maybe push the bedroom in the back, and then that way she has more privacy. The purpose of
looking at that interaction between the audience and the presenter is so you can think about questions, you can think about behavior within the meeting, and so they can use that as a model for when they go back to their groups.
This is the laundry area, and then here's the pantry to store all the clothes. Right here we have a little office.
We practice different ways to present to their clients. We talk about eye contact, we talk about confidence, we talk about postures, we talk about volume of your voice.
Hello, my name is America. Hello, my name is Christopher. And the title of our project is Tiny Houses. Our driving question of this project is, given a budget, how can we as a design team plan a home for a family?
The last day of this journey is for them to really present their work to their clients. And they were so excited.
Did you have a hard time building the house?
Kind of, yeah. We had to redo some of the walls so that they were the exact measurement. This is the master bedroom. The middle is the kitchen. Here's a room.
They shared their blueprints, they shared their layout, they shared their budget, and they shared their opinion paragraphs that they wrote so that they can try to persuade their clients to purchase their home.
It's amazing that was done with elementary school students, isn't it? So, when we think about the role of the teacher in the video, we talked about how there's like a traditional classroom and that the teacher plays a particular role there and uses particular strategies. And I think that we see some of those same strategies being used here, right? They are giving mini lectures about some mathematical concepts. They're leading students in discussions with creating that need-to-know list. So asking questions, writing down the things that students say. The teacher is explicitly linking skills or the standards to the projects with that Cheez-Its activity, right? So learning about the geometry and the measuring skills needed to complete the tiny house project. And then when I look at this and when I've talked with teachers about this, some of the things that people seem to like about this project, or they look at the project and think, yeah, I'd like to see that in my classroom, are the fact that students are moving around, but they're moving around with intention and with purpose. They are, laying out all those rulers and stuff on the floor, that the students are interacting well with other adults. The teacher has the other teacher come in and act as the audience for the run through of the presentations, and then the clients come in and the students do presentations to clients. This is something that I do in my college courses a lot, particularly in the professional writing classes that I teach, and it is amazing. I think whether the child is 11 or whether the child is 21, that if you give students a real audience, if they know that they are going to present their work and to talk about their work with someone who isn't the teacher, that it goes beyond a grade, they tend to step up. They want to do well. They want to put forth their best selves for those outside audiences. And you can tell that it really pays off. The teacher talked about how they worked on skills like eye contact and body, posture and things like that. And you can really tell when they're presenting to these adults that they have confidence and that they do have pride in their work. Students clearly throughout the video are interested and engaged, and like I said, they are proud of their work. So as we look at projects to project-based learning, again, just to go over this, when you have project-based learning, the project is intended to teach significant content. The project creates the need to know the essential content. These students were building models of tiny houses, so there was the need to know stuff. In the need to know list that the teacher uses at the beginning of the project after it's been introduced through the Minecraft activity, she creates this need to know. What do we need to know? We need to know the budget. We need to know how big the family is. We need to know measurements, all of these things. So project creates a need to know essential content. Project is organized around an open-ended driving question. The driving question is something that we're going to work on here in a few minutes, but the driving question is the essential question that drives all the inquiry. So in this case with the tiny house project, it was how do we create a house with this budget for the needs of this family? And then you move on from there to pursue the content in order to answer the question. Any kind of good project-based learning is going to include critical thinking, inquiry, problem solving, collaboration, communication, and then of course a public audience. So let's recap what we've gone over so far in this nearly an hour together here for this webinar. We have done an overview of project-based learning, talked about the roles of students and teachers in PBL, so like what the classroom looks like and how our roles are a little different than a traditional approach. The differences between projects and project-based learning, and then how PBL actually looks in a classroom. And I hope that that video was illustrative of that for you. So now this is the time where we start thinking about our own projects. Okay, so we would like to see this kind of engagement in our classroom. Yes, we would like for students to understand that what they learn in school has application outside of the classroom. Yes, we want our students to interact, you know, in these great confident ways with adults and have real clients and talk to people. Yes. So how do we go about that? What does it actually look like to design a project? Because as we know, this stuff that we saw in that tiny house project didn't just happen, right? There was a lot of planning that went into making that work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the essential project design elements for gold standard project-based learning. And again, as I've said before, most of this material comes from the Buck Institute for Education, or PBL Works. Buck Institute is what it was called for many years, and they've sort of rebranded themselves. So we're going to talk through each one of these pieces of this circle, and you'll see that they all fit together, but in the very middle, it's the key knowledge, understanding, and success skills. In your downloads, you have this essential project design elements checklist. And what you can do is if you create a project, you can go through this checklist to kind of be like, do I have this? Do I have this? Do I have this? Do I have this? To know, are you meeting kind of the basic criteria for a gold standard or effective project-based learning unit. Now, when I teach my students how to design projects in my courses at FMU, this is the rubric I use. I use this rubric, you know, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? And then of course I give comments, but this is sort of your basic checklist. Like these are all of the things that you need. So what I'm going to do now is talk through each one of these, and I'm going to try to relate it to some of the projects that I've already talked about, like the road project, and this tiny house project. Okay, so we've just zoomed in here to the checklist, and again, you should have that in your downloads. Let's take the first one, key knowledge, understanding, and success skills. This refers to exactly what you think it is. This is to making sure that the project is focused on key knowledge and understanding that comes from our standards, but that there's also success skills that include things like critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, self-management, confidence, those things that, you know, in the tiny project she talked about, having good posture when you talk to people, eye contact. These are success skills, what are called life skills, soft skills. We call them lots of different things, but they are things that transcend disciplines and that students can use throughout their life. Now, oftentimes when I introduce teachers to project-based learning, their first thought is, oh my gosh, how am I going to link this to the standards? By the time they've designed a project, they say, do I have to list all of the standards that I'm going to cover? Because project-based learning really can incorporate a lot of different things. So when people are first starting to think about designing a project, what I often do is ask them to look through their standards. I want them to think about standards that sometimes they have a hard time teaching, or that students have a hard time really wrapping their heads around. Sometimes I say, why don't you look at the standards that you don't like to teach? I mean, most of us love what we do and we love our subject area, but there's always those things that you're like, ugh, I hate it when I have to teach this. Look at those and think maybe there's a project that you could design around some of the ones that you don't love to teach to make it more engaging and fulfilling for you too, as well as your students. So we're always focusing on knowledge, understanding, and skills, success skills, soft skills. All right. Now, every project should have a driving question, sometimes called a challenging problem or a challenging question. But this is a meaningful problem to solve or a question to answer. So with the Roach project that I talked about earlier, it might be something like, how can we help our school deal with the road problem? Okay, so that's like our central question, right? That's driving all of our inquiry. And for the tiny house, it was, how can we design a house for this budget, for this many people to meet these needs, whatever. So it is a question that is not Googleable, but it's a question designed to propel the learning of the content. And like I said, right, we're going to spend a little time on driving questions here in a few minutes, because I do think it's one of the hardest things about designing a project, because you've got to have a good one. Sustained inquiry. This means that this is not something that students can do in a day. What I recommend for teachers who are new to project-based learning is to maybe design a project that lasts 3 weeks. I think you can get a lot of done over 3 weeks. It also depends on the age of children that you're teaching, their abilities, their developmental abilities, all kinds of things like this. So don't start with, I'm going to do a semester-long project. That is asking a lot of yourself and of your students. So start with some smaller projects and see where that gets you. Authenticity. A really good project-based learning project has some kind of real-world context. And sometimes that real-world context is going to be having an actual client. But sometimes the real-world context is the tools that you're using, or a process that you're using. That is so it's in some way connected with the real world, with things that people actually do in life. So an example with the tiny house is it's connected to designing a house, right? Remember when the guest came in and he brought the blueprints, and the students were like, oh, blueprints, look at the blueprints, because that's a real world thing. And I think when people can see that, wow, we are actually going to be doing this, or look, I have to use math if I want to create blueprints, something like that, then authenticity level goes up and engagement level goes up. But again, it doesn't have to be that there's a real client. I've seen projects that are more sort of scenario based, where teachers ask students to imagine that you are living in this time period and you have this problem. Write a letter to, back to King George about what's going on in the colonies, or something like that. And the real world part of it is the letter. The real world part of it is that letter writing is a thing that people do. And so there can be kind of varying levels of authenticity, and I'll show you a scale for that here in a minute too. All right, student voice and choice. I want to sit with this one for a minute, because I have made some mistakes regarding student voice and choice. What this means is that students are allowed to make some choices about the products that they create, or about how they work, or about kind of what kind of tendril they follow in a project. So when I first started doing what I didn't know was project-based learning. I didn't call it that, but I would have students design projects, and I would let them pick what genre they were going to write in, if they were going to make it a letter or a brochure or a traditional essay or a PowerPoint. I would let them choose their audiences. I would let them choose their topics. And there was too much choice. They were sort of floundering and didn't have anything to anchor themselves to. So with project-based learning, if you were going to do something with your students, you might say, all right, this is our central question. Our central question is, how can we make posters that for our library that celebrate the unsung heroes of South Carolina? How can we create effective posters that do this? What you might do is say, okay, I'm going to give students choice in who they pick to do for this. Or I'm going to give students complete choice in the design of their posters. Or maybe I'm not going to give students complete choice of design of their posters. I'm going to give them a template and then they can pick the people. So in some areas you do have the boundary. You say, you know, this is what this poster is going to look like. We've learned these design elements and we're all going to use this template. So that decision has been made. But then you let them choose the figure that they're going to put in there. So there's all kinds of different ways to do this, but don't feel like just because it says student choice that they have to have choice in everything, because it can be pretty overwhelming. All right, reflection. It's, you know, John Dewey says that, you know, there is no learning without reflection, that we really don't learn something until after we stop and consider for ourselves what that knowledge means for us, or how we can use it, or how it has influenced us or changed us, or how we're going to apply it in the future. So give students some time to say, okay, this is how I feel about the project now. This is where I feel like we need to go next. Even simple project logs and things like that can be part of reflection. Critique and revision. So the project includes processes for students to give and receive feedback on their work in order to revise. All right, so not just feedback at the end in order to give a grade, but feedback so that they can make it better before the final exhibition, of that project. So as we saw in the tiny house video, the other teacher came in and gave them a little feedback about things before they presented to their client. So a chance for students to get some feedback and to make something better. And then a good project-based learning project, there's some kind of public product. Ideally, it's a presentation to someone outside of just their peers or just the classroom. And we can talk about some scenarios for that as well. So yes, it's a big checklist and there's lots and lots of things to consider. But those are all the elements. But something else that we've got to figure out is, how do we even find a project topic? What is my project about? If I'm going to design a project, how do I actually get to an idea? And that can be really hard to get our heads around. So I want to spend some time talking about, what is my project about? How do I even come up with a project idea? So here are some things that you can do. You can borrow and customize a project from someone else. On the PBL Works webpage, there are several different ways to get to a project, and I want to show that to you here in a second. Okay, so this is the PBL Works webpage, and they do ask you to create an account and sign in, but that's not a very big deal. You just log in, and then all of the content here is free. So if you go to projects, this is the kind of thing you'll find. So let's go ahead and click on one of these. So let's just go here. This project's called Hunger. And the driving question is, how can we affect hunger in our community? And every one of these projects has all of this information. These are the key standards for ELA and literacy. And then they include here some resources that you can use with this project. This is one of the more fleshed out projects that they have on here. So that's super detailed. Not all of them are going to be that way. This tells us what grades are involved here. And what I'm seeing here with grades K through 12 is that there's got to be a way to kind of scale it up or scale it down. Let's look at another one. This one's called Bridging the Gap. It has a driving question of, how can we support younger students through the transition from middle school? And let's take a look at the project overview here. The description: transitioning from elementary school to middle can be exciting yet scary. This acknowledges older middle school students by giving them the opportunity to create a survival guide for 5th and 6th grade students. So they do surveys and they research informational texts and then they create this guide that informs their peers. So it talks about things that you need to consider with students and the context and the content and skills. And over here you have the standards that it covers. So very basically, one of the things you can do as you start thinking about projects is go to PBL Works and see what's already out there. And you don't have to pick up the project wholesale. You can look at it and say, okay, you know, I like this part of it, I like this part of it, or wow, this is written for helping students to transition into middle school. But I think that, you know, my 9th graders could do a really good one about transitioning to high school. So be open when you look at these and think about the possibilities and what other standards might even fit. So it's organized by science standards, by math, subject area, grade level, all of these things, and there are just some excellent projects. Additionally, while we're here, I'll just talk through some other things that are on the PBL Works website. Some of these are in your downloads already. You have Project Planner, and then resources include videos and rubrics and strategy guides and handouts that you can even use with your own students. So I wanted to show you that one of the things you can do as you start trying to come up with project ideas is to see what's already out there. And PBL Works is a great place to start. Okay, so borrow and customize a project from someone else or from the website. There you go. Another way that you can get to a project idea would be to revamp one of your existing projects. So let's say that you have a project that you really like that's worked well with the students, but you think, you know what, this could be more robust. It's pretty much a dessert project. Think about how you can make that project more central and take that product idea or that set of processes that go into making that project and tweak it so that it does become more main course instead of dessert. Sort of like as we talked about with those South Carolina history posters, and I think there was another one that we discussed, one that you sort of can be a dessert or you can make it main course. Generate a new idea, come up with something completely new, but you don't have to do that. Another way to come up with a project is to think about ways to connect with community and local business. If, so we talked about, you know, designing a brochure, for example, about a local business. What's going on in the community that you think is significant or important? What kind of businesses are starting to play a bigger role? What do you think is important to highlight in your community? So look around at the work that other people are doing and see how you can link in with those real world happenings in those real world organizations. And kind of related to that is identify an issue with local significance. So again, this is still all in the vein of coming up with a project idea. Here are some different types of projects. So as I go through this, think about what types of projects are appealing to you, because you should pick something that engages you as an instructor. And that is one thing that I have heard over and over again in working with teachers, is that project-based learning has gotten them more excited about teaching. So let's talk about types of projects and see maybe if some of these appeal to you. So one type of project is solving a real world problem. So some questions, you know, how do I find a real world problem? What types of products could students produce? And what might that path to the product look like? So here's some examples. You know, maybe your district is looking to build a new school. Having high school students consider, you know, like, where should that new school be built? This could be a project for math. This could be, you could make this a social studies project, I think, probably, and thinking about education and the history of education and looking at our schools and policies and that kind of stuff. But that would be an example of a real world problem. Also, you know, thinking locally within your own school. This is another driving question. How can we design a theater set that adds meaning and power to a production? So this does not even have to be in a theater class, right? This could be when you read Julius Caesar. The whole time you're reading Julius Caesar, you're thinking about what's our set going to look like? Why is this going to be important? Why does this person need this prop? What is the significance of having this on the stage? So you're always kind of building your set and thinking about that as you read the play. So it's connecting it to something real world that's just outside of that Shakespeare text. Meeting a design challenge. Not every PBL project has to have a model or a design, but it could just be a proposal or a plan. So an example of, running some kind of business or service in your school, lots of PBL projects have turned into things like school stores or markets that happen on weekends. Something like, how can we build a birdhouse that's going to attract birds to the playground? And, through that process, you're studying birds and you're studying your local birds and migration patterns, and all kinds of cool things can go into just trying to figure out what type of birdhouse you can build. Developing plans for a skate park. There's actually a whole project on PBL Works about that. And then, something, in an engineering class or physics, constructing cardboard boats and having students test them. It sounds a little crazy. We did that at FMU a few years ago. There was this cardboard boat building contest, and you had physics and engineering and all of these different departments and clubs competing, and they actually put the boat in the water with a person in them. And there was a prize for the best design. So something like that. I don't know if you want to put your students at risk by putting them in a pond, but maybe you could get some teachers to volunteer or something. But things where students have a design challenge and have to use concepts from class in order to build this thing. But it doesn't always have to be these concrete things. Lots of times in disciplines such as history and English, you're going to have an exploration of a more abstract question that focuses on intangible ideas and concepts. So maybe your project has more abstract question like, what makes people take risks? Or when do we grow up? Are robots friends or foes? And maybe, these become presentations, or maybe they become gallery exhibitions where students are showing off, or a poetry slam or something where students are showing off their poetry and showing off their ideas about these abstract, more abstract kind of concepts. That's still project-based learning. Sometimes projects take the form of an investigation where you do surveys and you collect data and you analyze that data. And this is done through developing an intriguing question that has a nice complex answer. So, why do we find shark's teeth on beaches in South Carolina? I think that for me, it's summer, and that's something that I like to do with my kids. Is an interesting question, right? You have to know something about science, and you have to know something about numbers of teeth found and where are they found and all kinds of interesting things. So that's just one example of what an investigation might look like. The other project that was on PBL Works for the guide for middle schoolers, they talked about doing a survey in there too. So talking with real people, investigating in all kinds of different ways. How does e-learning affect students' attitudes towards school? This is a really timely one. The COVID pandemic has really made us think about commerce differently. It's made us think about our schools, work, all kinds of things. So I'm sure that there's tons of projects that are in there. I know that when we were finishing our spring semester, I was teaching business writing, and their final project was to investigate. I set up a scenario where they were charged by their boss, who owned a small business, to come up with alternatives to Zoom. That Zoom was a good platform for having meetings for the business, but what were some other ones? And which one would they recommend? And why would they recommend that particular one? So they had to write a memo to the boss, and they had to investigate all of these other tools. And it was really related to what was going on currently, and so that gave them some engagement in that project. Another thing is you can have students take a position on an issue. Let me go ahead and show you this video. This is a pretty extensive one that they did at a school in California, but I think maybe you can get something out of it. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this video as well.
Television has fundamentally changed American politics. And as people that are about to be voters, you need to understand the role that television plays to help you become an informed voter. And the best way to do that is for you guys to become television commercial makers yourselves. That's what this project's all about. Our school is rooted in a commitment to what we call project-based learning. Students engage with the curriculum by actively constructing something, rather than the sort of traditional mode of kind of receiving knowledge and then taking tests or writing essays that show that they've received the knowledge. We want to take it one step further. So there's lots of back and forth debate in our country about how much of a right does the government have to say about your private property. Campaign Ads for Voters is a project in which students study what's on the November ballot and take a position on one of the propositions, make a 30-second campaign commercial that tries to change a voter's mind to vote the way they'd like to vote, and then they screen that on the night before the election to a group of voters and try to participate in that way in the actual election.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president, you like I.
We started by showing the students some actual campaign commercials.
Barack Obama, a new vision for our economy.
Proposition 19 is a poorly written bill that benefits...
We also showed them some student commercials from doing this project 2 years ago. Even though you don't have huge budgets for these ads, you have lots of tools at your disposal. These were all done on iMovie. One of the aspects of good project design is you create what we call a need to know. Rather than saying to the students, learning the 3 branches of government is important, so study it. We present the students with a question or a problem or a challenge that excites them. Then you harness that excitement. The students quickly realize that, wow, I'm going to need to know this, this, and this. The students presented a proposal. This was the first of multiple written essays through the whole project. This proposal asked the students to identify 3 propositions that interested them. They also got to identify 1 student in the class with whom they might like to work. We, the teachers, collated all that and started to create groups. The first group activity depends on who ends up in your group. If you're lucky, all 5 people all had the same yes or no position on the same proposition. For it to be that clean was rare. They had to now negotiate, collaborate, and figure out as a group, what is our group's position going to be.
Prop 2 is also known as standards for the amendment of farm animals.
It's really important, I think, in project-based learning that the work is public. In a sense, published at every step along the way, and that the students get this sort of feedback from a larger group. So each individual group would come up to the front of the room and publicly state, this is the proposition that we've decided upon, this is the position we're taking, these are the pro arguments, these are the con arguments, these are some of our initial thinkings about how we might approach this. And then get feedback from the rest of the class.
I had a weird question about your pros and cons sort of thing that had to do with
So we're taking the position of yes on 1A. It would bring a high-speed rail to California that would link Northern California to Southern California. Originally, we all individually, personally supported this. But as we kind of got more and more into reading the actual bill itself, I think we just kind of decided that it just wasn't the right time for it. It's a little too expensive and things like that. But we decided to continue on the yes on Prop 1A because it's a little more of a challenge to convince other people of something you may not yourself be convinced of.
So you couldn't interview your sister. Did you interview anyone? Did you interview anyone? Your parents?
The key to this project is figuring out their target voter. So they had to figure out what are the issues, what is the sort of constellation of issues that this proposition addresses or is influenced by, and then go out and start talking to voters.
We were supposed to just do a bunch of interviews with people we knew and decide what would a good swing voter group be to like aim our ads specifically at this group of voters to try and sway them to vote yes. And through our interviews we decided to do working class females from the ages of 30 to 50, and we felt
that group that did Prop 1A on the train, what they learned in that focus group research was exactly what I was hoping all students learn. That sometimes what you think the proposition's about, the surface level, is actually not what's motivating the voter to go a certain way.
Working class, they don't have a lot of extra money to be spending on gas and high cost of airplanes and stuff like that. So we figured, and just males would just be, we figured they'd be more excited by the idea of a train. So we figured females would be like a challenging group to go, but we also feel like it wouldn't be too hard to sway them over to vote yes.
They realized that they didn't need to make a transportation argument. They actually needed to make an economic argument.
To try and change drug offenders so that they do not make the same mistake again.
So we have to get all this stuff, all the images, and then start.
How are you gonna get this?
That's not going to be hard.
So far in the project, it's been sort of a critical thinking and an intellectual process. And now they're able to sort of apply that. And that's why I love about projects. You show that you know something deeply when you're able to use that in the process of creation. They needed to again present that, needed to be signed off on that before they got any technology, before they were able to start producing the commercial itself.
One,
it's script, remember.
2, 3.
Tired of being trapped in traffic. Tired of the rising cost of gas.
Yes.
Tired of pollution.
Yes.
Prop 1A allows the government to...
Once the script and storyboard were signed off, satisfactory, the students were able to have access to computers, video cameras, the software that they needed. We have a computer lab, we have laptops. Some students needed to go out and get live footage, other students just needed to collect imagery on the internet. Our digital media teacher was also teaching a class that had a lot of these students in it, and they were working on the video and some in that context.
With Prop 87, the only guarantee is higher gas prices. Vote no on Prop 87.
The rough cut feedback session really tells the students what they need to do next. Most of what needs to be said about the commercial in terms of improving it is said by the students in the audience. I'll speak last often and I'll add a couple things that may not have been mentioned, but the students, after many years of this, are really good at giving each other constructive criticism.
But it's actually not rising, so we'll just pretend that we made this like a couple weeks ago.
In the final days, this is when the mad scramble occurs. You know, we've got 120 students. The ads are coming in or not coming in, as the case may be. We're trying to gather them up on hard drives, get them into the right QuickTime format. Computers are shutting down, work's getting lost, people are screaming. It's a wild time toward the end.
Tired of being trapped in traffic? Tired of pollution? Tired of the...
One of the things I love about project-based learning is that we create these authentic deadlines. I think students so often, when you don't have this sort of Friday night lights, we like to call it, dimension to the learning, they see so many of the dates that we give them as arbitrary.
We need major surgery. Help us break the cycle. Vote no.
There was just an energy in the night where the voters and the adults and the parents could really see.
Okay, so I find that to be sort of an inspirational project. I think it really does pull together all of those elements on the sheet, and this would be an example of taking a position on an issue and also finding a project that links with your local or state community. So one of the things that you could do now would be just to do a little brainstorming. So go ahead and hit pause, get out that essential elements sheet, maybe scroll back through the part of the presentation talking about how to find a project, and think about, what subject area or topic you might want to look at and what type of project you want to do. Would you want it to be kind of investigative or abstract or very centered in a real world issue, whether that be at the school or in town or in your state. And think about what kind of project you would imagine students doing at the end and a couple of activities they might do to get there. Again, just put some ideas down after seeing that video. Go ahead and do this now while some ideas are fresh, and then come on back and we will move on. Okay, so if we were able to spend half a day together or even a full day, what it would probably do at this point would be, to share your project ideas and talk about what you've come up with and give each other feedback. But what I'm hoping you'll do instead is maybe share your idea with some of your colleagues, or take what you've written and look at PBL Works, or even simply Google PBL, and science, or PBL in middle school math, or something like that, so that you can get other people's ideas. Now, I'm going to go through just some topics related to design, and then we're going to talk about driving questions before we wrap up today. So, I said that we would get back to this notion of authenticity, and I just wanted to touch on this a little bit more. When we think about project-based learning, it's good to think about authenticity in terms of, is there something about my project that is authentic, that is mirrored in the real world, that's going to feel to students like what we're learning is applicable or recognizable in the real world or just outside of school. So looking at this authenticity continuum, on the low end, we have isolated, discrete tasks unrelated to real life problems. So even though I'm an English teacher, I would argue that writing an essay about Hamlet's personality traits, or, who is the hero in the Odyssey, or I don't know, whatever, that those types of assignments, there's a lot of reasons to not assign a paper like that. But one of them is that it's absolutely disconnected from anything that students are going to do in real life. Okay, so first of all, authenticity is one of those things that we need to spend a little bit of time on. And what we have here is an authenticity continuum. Sometimes people get frustrated with project-based learning because they think, well, I don't have a real client, or I just moved to this area and I haven't made any connections in the community, so I don't have anyone to come into my class and work with my students. And it's not an all or nothing kind of prospect. With authenticity, what we're going for is that students can see something in this project that relates to something that they've seen somewhere else, or that connects with either types of writing that they've seen in the real world or processes that they've seen in the real world. So if we go to the far left of this authenticity continuum, we see low authenticity, and these are isolated, discrete tasks unrelated to real life problems. So there's a couple of things that I think about when I think about this. I think about the research papers that I had to do. There's one I remember specifically in science. I did something about blood. And we had to do all of the research and write quotes or summarize information on a note card. Some of you might remember doing this. You would write information on a note card. You would also have the source, the full source information all written out, and then you would take these note cards and assemble them and somehow or another get an essay out of this. I've never once needed to write sources on a note card again. Were there analytical skills that I learned doing that, or reading skills that I learned doing that? Absolutely. I'm not saying I didn't get anything out of the project, but when we ask students to do something like in an English class where they have to write about, is Hamlet a hero, or, something like this, again, they might be getting some analytical skills, but that product that they're doing, that essay, not only does it get boring for teachers to read, but it's also like something that they'll never ever do outside of school. So trying to make learning more authentic, more connected to their lives outside of school is what we're getting at here. So simulations, or simple real life problems and simulations in mathematics or in the writing classroom, for example. This gets us a little further down to the right of the authenticity scale. Complex problems that simulate real life problems. So again, this sometimes happens in history classes where students have to imagine themselves in a particular historical context and use what they've learned to create documents or to propose a course of action. Again, they're not really living back in the 19th century, but it's simulating a situation and it's getting them deeply into that material. And then on our high authenticity skills, of course, those problems where they're designing the tiny house or fixing the roach problem. Okay, so another thing related to this is the major projects. So sometimes people think, well, I understand the processes that I want students to do and I understand the content I want them to cover, but I don't know like what these projects or the products, the deliverables, the things that they turn in and have assessed what they look like. So when you think about that, you should think about authenticity. You should think about feasibility. Make sure that you're not assigning a project where students have to learn, 17 new skills in order to do it. Having someone come into your classroom and teaching students, how to work with a particular podcasting software, or having someone come in to teach them something about, designing documents, whatever, though that's really good. But try not to do something where they have to learn that new skill and then, 14 other things along the way. Also, consider when you're doing your project, which parts of this students are going to do on their own and which parts of this they're going to do as a team. So you might have quizzes and tests that, of course, students are going to be doing on their own. You might have students each do individual pieces of research and then bring that together to the team. So these are just things to think about as you select projects. And I've come up with this list, and I have another list of things in the downloads for you as well. But different types of presentations, ways to do presentations. It doesn't just have to be a person standing up in front of another person. Writing, different types of writing that are authentic. Media and technology, again, these are authentic in terms of the fact that they exist outside of school. Constructed projects, and then, of course, planning projects. Okay. Other things to consider: the number of students that you have in the class, the timing and the duration of the project. Is this a project that you're going to do at the beginning of a new term? Is this a project that you think is going to work best at the end of the year? Think about where it fits, both with the knowledge that your students will have and their familiarity with one another and with you. And then complexity. Consider how many people do I have to get involved with this? Do I need to team up with other teachers in different subjects and that kind of thing? And again, just start simple. You do not have to do a 6-week project your first time out. And then you decide what standards you'd like to meet. And don't forget those success skills that you want students to learn. Consider how you're going to explicitly teach independence or critical thinking or time management as you move through these projects. Again, on the PBL Works website, there are some terrific handouts that are, and I'll put some of these up in the downloads for you as well, but they're handouts that students can put in a folder that are project management handouts. This is what we did today. This is what needs to do next time. This is what Tom did today. This was what Susan did today. This is what Amelia did today. This is what they're going to do the next time or by the time we come together again in class. So tools to help students manage their time. Then there's also some presentation rubrics that students can use as they prepare presentations. So lots and lots and lots of resources in that PBL Works website. Go ahead and mine that because it's amazing the things that they have thought about. And then we always want to be considering how we are going to make students' work public. Maybe it's usable. It's something that people use. It's the cabinet that they build. It's the posters they put up at the library. Sometimes it's about presentation. It's about, just simply telling the superintendent what you learned about the roach situation. Throw a party. Have a celebration of your students' work. I've worked with schools where they do a project-based learning expo, and the parents come in and they show off the kind of work that they've been doing, and they talk about how it's connected to the real world and all of this good stuff. So have a party. Show off the work that your students have done. Display it. Think about setting up like a gallery for your students to exhibit their poetry or to show off particular products that they've made in your class. Publish it. Of course, the internet has given us all kinds of wonderful ways to showcase and publish student work. So doing that through the proper channels, posting it and sending it, making sure that people see what your students have done. All right, I want to move real quickly now to show you this project planning document. Again, it's from PBL Works. Again, I put it in the downloads for you, but I just want to talk through it because it can help you take the idea that you came up with and flesh it out a little bit, and it takes into account the considerations of that project design elements. I just want to talk about that in a minute. So here is a PDF of the project planner that they have in PBL Works, and here you see opportunity, put in your project title, what the public product, sort of what that end piece might look like, the driving questions, which we'll talk about, grade level, time frame, and then a little summary of the project. If you are interested, I can always set up a session to do with teachers either in your department or at your school, where maybe they can watch this webinar and then create project planning, and then we can meet online or do a Zoom meeting where we talk about what we've come up with, and I can give you some feedback on that. So please let me know if that's something that you're interested in, or even after this webinar, if you want to fill one of these out and send it to me. I'm happy to check that out. We can have a phone call, or I can just do some written feedback for you. So please keep that in mind. This is a great way of organizing your thoughts on your project. And then here you have learning goals. I don't think it's necessary to fill in all of the boxes here on this section, but it does have you think about success skills and literacy skills and standards that you want to hit with this project. All right, so this one is project milestones, and I want to go ahead and read the instructions on this. It says, use this section to create a high-level overview of your project. Think of this as the broad outline of the story of your project. So if we think back to the tiny house, that story started with Minecraft. My story is that I want students to understand that they can build things, and that the considerations, things that are important to them when they think about a place that they might want to live. Then the next step would be they present these and they talk through, and we talk about what's important in a space. Then what I'm going to do is explain that they're going to build a tiny house, and so on and so forth. So like, what are the moments in your project? Again, a bird's eye view here. As you develop these, consider how the inquiry process is unfolding and what learning will take place, and then the project calendar will allow you to build out the milestones in greater detail. So this just breaks it down into 6. Great way to do project-based learning planning is to do backwards planning. I'm sure you've talked about this and thought about this before. What is that public product, and then what do you need to do to get back there? On the PBL Works, there are some of these that are filled out, so you can get a sense, but you know, just try to fill this in and think about the different steps and what kinds of questions you're helping students answer as you move along. And then this has a more detailed planner in here for you. And then here's a resource to help you fill these things in, that kind of explaining the different categories. So again, this is the project planner. And I think here's a project planner with notes in it. Okay, so with this one, you can see this just has some little explanatory text, okay? With some examples. All right, so I hope that that's helpful as you start putting together your project. Okay, so the next thing I want us to cover is the notion of the driving question. And this is a quote from Setting the Standard for Project-Based Learning, which I mentioned very early on in the podcast, in the webinar. Okay, so let's talk about creating the driving question. Here's a quote from Setting the Standard for Project-Based Learning, the text that I mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar. The driving question reminds students why they are completing the project. It's crafted to incite students' interest and focus their attention on the key ideas, questions, and knowledge at the heart of the project. So, this is one of the ways that I think about this is like a globe in the middle of the room. So I don't know how many of you are Star Wars fans or people who have watched Star Wars, but this is how I think about the driving question. There is always a moment in any Star Wars movie where the leaders, the planetary leaders, or the pilots, or whoever is, in the middle of this action gather and they look at some kind of map, whether it's like the plans for the Death Star or, some kind of galactic map or whatever, and they're all around it and everyone's focused on this thing in the middle of the room. And that's how I think about the driving question. So for example, for the tiny house one, it was, how do we create a tiny house within a certain budget to meet our clients' needs? And that's what everything's always goes back to. When you create a need-to-know list, the question is, what do we need to know in order to do this? When you are doing research, the research is about trying to answer that question. So it's always sitting in the middle of the room. What I would do is I would write the driving question on the board or on a big sticky note. I would do a need-to-know list. I'll have some reading about need-to-know lists in your packet as well with the downloads, so you could see that. And then you're always focused when you're using class time to talk about your project, you're focused on answering this question. So one of the ways that we think about driving questions is it's a way of focusing us in our planning. It's also a way of helping to focus students. The important thing about driving questions is that they're not Googleable, but they are complicated enough to have that sustained inquiry, to cover standards, to be challenging for students, to be engaging. So if you look at like the checklist, like you want to make sure that your driving question is going to help you check those things off. So let's take each of these one by one. I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking through these. So if you had a driving question for a project that was, how can we design an appropriate memorial for our city's founder? Okay, so your city's been founded by this particular person, there's no memorial. That would be a really interesting question, right? We have how can we, so it's framed in such a way that it is requiring inquiry. Does that make sense? You have to do some thinking and some digging about design, about who the city founder was, all of that good stuff. You can't Google it, right? You might be able to find out something about the city planner or the city's founder or how to design a memorial, but it's a question that is big enough to drive inquiry. So we're going to say check on that driving question. What can we learn from coming of age stories? Okay, so again, having students in your class read some coming of age stories, having part of your, have 3 different coming of age stories, one group reads one group reads another, you come back together, you try to figure out like, why do people write these? Who are they written for? What are we supposed to get out of them? And we're going to, write to the library making an argument that we need more coming of age stories, or maybe we're going to write and say, no, we're good, we're tired of them, we need something else. So yeah, I would say that we're going to put a check next to that driving question. One of the things about that driving question is it's a little teacherly. It's not very exciting, but it gets the job done. All right, number 3, what are the consequences of World War I for Germany? Can you Google that? Yes. Yes. Were the consequences fair? Were the consequences, what were the consequences of the consequences? That's a different question, but simply what were they? You can Google that. All right. How do you build a bookcase? Googleable? Yes, you can look that up. Now, if they're designing an elementary school down the street and they need to put new bookcases in, and they're trying to figure out how they can create a reading space for young readers that will encourage them to sit down with books, to be able to choose books, to be able to go to books that meet their interests and reading levels and all this kind of thing. They're young readers. Is that a different question? Yes, that's a very different question. Or if we were trying to design a library in order to be accessible to people with all varying levels of abilities and needs, that would be another question. But simply, how do we build a bookcase? Googleable. So we're going to say that's not a very effective driving question. What can the food of a particular time period tell us about the people, the values, and the relationship to nature? Sure, I'm going to call that a driving question. Again, it's a little teacherly. You might have to spice up that question some, but you might be looking at a particular time in history, and food isn't always a great way into a topic to think about. Why were they eating this at this time? What did it have to do with the kinds of things they valued in terms of animals? What animals would they eat? What animals wouldn't they eat? What was the climate in such a way that they ate this thing but not another thing? So that having a question that is centered around food that touches on all of these other things, that could be a really fun project, and you could end up doing some fun cooking things or demonstration things. So I'm going to go ahead and say check on that driving question. And then the last one sort of touches on an example that I've given before about what are the major themes in Hamlet. Completely Googleable. The other thing about questions like this is they're very plagiarizable. To have what are the major themes in Hamlet, a student can go online and they can find a paper on that in 3 minutes. And so the other cool thing about project-based learning, for those of you who are concerned about plagiarism, is it's pretty hard to plagiarize a project that you have designed for a specific context, audience, purpose, and with a level of authenticity. Okay, so this is just a really quick exercise on how you might revise a question. So what if you wanted to do something with math and baseball? So how is math used in baseball field design? Well, you could Google that question and you would get some answers to it. But what about this? What is the better ball field for players or for hitters, Turner Field or Fenway Park? Well, what happens when you turn the first thing into the revised question? It all of a sudden becomes engaging. It becomes specific. It's about using the math instead of just answering the question, how was it used? It's actually students using the math on their own, thinking critically. They're going to be making judgments and, of course, doing some analysis with that as well. So this is another activity from the Buck Institute that can kind of help you create driving questions, framing words, should, how, do, and then thinking about person or entity, we as a class, or we as a nation, or we as South Carolina. And then what's our action? Are we going to solve a problem or design or create something? And then the audience for our school, for parents, for middle schoolers, for high schoolers. And so these are just some examples that kind of pick up on each one of these sections. Should Columbia take measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19? How can we communicate our PBL initiative to parents? Should our library contain books that have been banned in the past? So again, these are driving questions, and they are questions that drive your inquiry. So I think that you can start to plan a project, and as you plan, the driving question will sort of emerge. If you can't come up with a driving question for your project that isn't Googleable, I would talk to some colleagues and see how you can make that more an inquiry-based kind of question. Because maybe if your driving question is Googleable, maybe you're headed towards a dessert project. I don't know. So think about that driving question again. If you want to shoot some driving questions to me and I can give you a hand with that, I'm happy to do that. So as you draft your projects, again, I recommend going to that planning document and working on that. And I think that gives you enough to go on as an introduction to project-based learning. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Again, if you have a group of teachers, even if it's just 4 or 5 of you who want to watch this webinar and then design some projects and talk about them, I'm happy to do that. Or if you would like a part 2, if you would like to design some projects as a group and I can lead you through another session that's a more advanced session in project-based learning, I am more than happy to do that as well. Please let me know and we'll see what we can set up. This is my email address. Make sure you like us on Facebook at Center of Excellence for College and Career Readiness, and visit our website for additional resources and also to learn more about the events that we have coming up. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll talk to you next time.